Quit, or I'll make your life hell, my manager growled, cornering me by the stairwell. His expensive watch glinted as he jabbed a finger toward my chest. Nobody will believe you're missing 8 million theory. Remember who signs your paychecks. I nodded quietly and left, not in surrender, in calculation. The moment the stairwell door closed behind me, I leaned against the cold concrete wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. The threat wasn't empty. Ryland had destroyed careers before mine. 6 months ago, Tilly from accounting vanished after questioning a suspicious wire transfer. 2 weeks later, Penn from compliance disappeared after flagging unusual activity patterns. Both labeled as difficult before being pushed out. Now I was next. My hands trembled as I returned to my desk, feeling the weight of eyes tracking my every move. The spreadsheet on my screen showed the evidence in black and white, 8 million systematically siphoned from client accounts over 3 years. The numbers couldn't lie, even if everyone else in this building did. I had 2 choices: walk away or risk everything. Before I tell you what choice I made, can I be honest with you? Many people listen to stories like mine, but never engage with them. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever stood alone against something bigger than yourself, please consider subscribing. Not just for me, but for others who need to know they're not alone in fighting back. Stay with me to the end. What happened next changed everything. My name is Devra Winters. 5 years ago, I was nobody special. Just a 24-year-old with a mathematics degree and student loans that kept me awake at night. Growing up with a mother who cleaned other people's houses, I'd promised myself I'd build security through education. Numbers made sense to me when people didn't. In equations, there was always a clear answer if you looked hard enough. Paladin Financial Services was my dream job, or so I thought. A prestigious investment firm managing billions in client assets. When they hired me as an administrative assistant, I was ecstatic. The marble lobby with its towering windows overlooking the city felt like stepping into another world. Coffee, 2 sugars, became Ryland's only words to me most mornings. He never looked up from his monitor when I placed it on his desk. Standing at 6'2" with steel gray hair and custom suits, Ryland controlled the Special Investments Division with absolute authority. The board trusted him implicitly. He'd generated consistent returns even during market downturns. What they didn't know was why. For 2 years, I brought coffee, organized files, and scheduled meetings. I became invisible, furniture, in human form. But I watched. I listened. After hours, when the building emptied, I taught myself the firm's accounting systems through online courses and training manuals. My break came when Justine, the junior financial analyst, quit suddenly. The quarterly audit was approaching, and they needed someone, anyone, to handle data entry. She knows our systems. I overheard Ryland tell Howard, the operations director, "We can pay her half what we'd pay a new hire, just until we find someone qualified." That night, I went home to my tiny apartment and screamed into my pillow, half in excitement, half in anger. They thought I was just a coffee girl. They had no idea I'd spent 2 years studying every aspect of financial reporting while they ignored my existence. When I started in financial oversight, I noticed small inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic, just numbers that didn't quite align. Transactions rounded oddly. Timestamps that didn't match trading hours. Client funds that disappeared for days before reappearing in different accounts. I created a separate spreadsheet tracking every anomaly. Patterns emerged, always amounts under regulatory thresholds, always during high-volume trading periods when oversight was stretched thin. 3 months into my new role, I stayed late, cross-referencing historical data. That's when I found it, a shadow accounting system. For every official transaction, there was a mirror movement. Small percentages skimmed from thousands of accounts, routed through shell companies, before disappearing offshore. Over 3 years, these rounding errors totaled 8 million. The next morning, I approached Ryland's office, naive enough to believe he might be unaware. "I found some transaction inconsistencies," I said, placing my analysis on his desk. "I think someone might be manipulating client funds." He barely glanced at my work. "Financial systems are complex, Devra. What looks like an inconsistency to a beginner is often just standard industry practice. But the pattern suggests, that's enough. His tone shifted. You've been hired to support, not investigate. Focus on your assigned tasks. Within days, my workload doubled. Reports that were previously approved came back with arbitrary revisions. Meetings happened without me. My access to certain financial databases was restricted for security upgrades. Then the whispers started. I overheard Ryland telling Howard I was emotionally unstable. At lunch, conversations stopped when I entered the break room. Emails I sent went unanswered. Celia, the regional vice president who had championed my promotion, was suddenly transferred to the Singapore office. My only ally, gone overnight. I was being isolated, discredited before I could speak. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated how invisible I had become. While they watched me during working hours, no one noticed me staying late. No one questioned why the cleaning crew let me into the building on weekends. No one realized I was meticulously documenting everything. For 6 months, I built my case. The transfers followed a precise schedule tied to regulatory filing dates. They created illusions of compliance while using investor funds for private ventures, real estate developments in emerging markets, cryptocurrency schemes, and personal expenses disguised as business costs. 7 people were involved across 3 departments. Ryland was the architect, but Howard handled the domestic transfers. Lyra, from compliance, ensured audit blind spots. Ashwin in IT maintained the shadow system. 3 others managed various aspects of the scheme. I needed help, but who would believe me against Ryland's reputation? That's when I remembered Professor Imani Okoro from my university days. She had left academia to work with financial regulators. I reached out through her personal email, careful to use my private account. 2 days later, we met at a coffee shop 10 miles from my workplace. This is significant, she said after reviewing my evidence, but dangerous. These people won't just lose their jobs if exposed. They'll face prison time. I know. My voice was steadier than I felt. Are you prepared for what comes next? Once this starts, there's no going back. Was I? My entire future hung on this decision. My career, possibly my safety. I thought about the clients, retirees, small business owners, families saving for college. Their trust exploited by people who already had more than enough. Yes, I answered. I'm ready. Through Professor Okoro, I connected with investigators who had been watching several investment firms but lacked inside proof. They needed documented evidence and a witness willing to testify. For weeks, I played defeated at work. I hunched my shoulders, avoided eye contact, took lunch at my desk. I became exactly what they thought I was, broken and compliant. All while feeding information to the investigation team. We identified the next major transfer would happen during the quarterly leadership summit, when all 7 conspirators would be in the building simultaneously. The perfect moment to catch them all. The night before, I couldn't sleep. Every possible scenario played through my mind. What if I was wrong? What if I had misinterpreted the data? What if they somehow discovered the investigation? Dawn broke as I sat on my balcony, watching the city awaken. Whatever happened today, nothing would be the same after. I arrived early, dressed in the same unremarkable clothes I always wore. Ryland watched me with contempt as I organized reports at my corner desk. To him, I was already forgotten, a problem solved, a threat neutralized. At precisely 9:30 a.m., when all conspirators gathered in the main conference room for their strategic planning session, I sent a simple text message. Now. 3 minutes later, the elevator doors opened. First came the auditors in their pressed suits, then investigators from the Securities Commission with their unwavering expressions. Finally, law enforcement officers, 32 in total, representing every jurisdiction where client money had been hidden. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I watched Ryland's face transform as the procession approached. Confusion, then disbelief, then a dawning horror as understanding set in. The conference room door opened. Ryland Hurst? The lead investigator's voice carried across the suddenly silent office. We have a warrant to search these premises and seize financial records related to client accounts. Every head turned toward me as I stood to join the investigators. The invisible assistant, now impossible to ignore. As Ryland was led past my desk in handcuffs, he hissed, "You're finished. My lawyers will destroy you." I met his gaze steadily. The numbers don't lie, Ryland. And neither do I. What he didn't know, authorities had already frozen accounts in 5 countries. The evidence I had gathered revealed the scheme reached into 4 other investment houses. And the 8 million, that was just the beginning of what they'd stolen. But the real revelation was still to come. As investigators seized computers and documents, I noticed Howard attempting to delete files from his phone. When security took it from him, I knew exactly what they would find: evidence of something far worse than financial fraud. The truth that would shock the entire financial industry was about to be revealed. The investigators confiscated Howard's phone immediately. He tried maintaining composure, but the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed him. I knew what they'd find: communications with political officials accepting bribes to look the other way. The corruption extended beyond our firm, reaching into regulatory bodies meant to protect investors. As the office descended into chaos, I stood silently watching. Junior staff huddled in corners, whispering frantically. Senior managers made frantic calls to their attorneys. Security escorted a steady stream of investigators carrying boxes of evidence to waiting vehicles. Monique, our receptionist, approached me cautiously. Did you do this?" "I just reported what I found," I replied, gathering my personal items. There was no reason to stay any longer. "But how? Everyone knows Ryland owns this place. Nobody crosses him." I paused, looking around at the office where I'd spent 5 years of my life. Someone had to. As I walked toward the elevator, staff members parted like water. Some glared with hostility. Others nodded slightly in silent acknowledgement. I'd become visible in the most dramatic way possible. Outside, rain fell steadily on the city streets. Detective Ilara Mendez waited under the building's awning, her dark eyes assessing me carefully. "We need to talk about protection," she said without preamble. "These people have connections. Things will get complicated." "I'm prepared for that," I replied, though my voice wavered slightly. "Are you?" Ryland made 3 calls before we confiscated his phone. One to his attorney, one to his wife. She paused. The third was to someone he referred to only as the cleaner. A chill ran through me despite the warm spring air. What does that mean? "It means you're coming with me now." That night, I slept in a hotel room under police protection, jumping at every sound in the hallway. My apartment was no longer safe. My old life had evaporated in a single morning. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Major financial fraud uncovered at Paladin Financial Services. 8 million scheme exposed. The article mentioned an unnamed whistleblower who had worked with authorities. By morning, the estimate had grown to 42 million as investigators uncovered the full scope of the operation. By evening, it reached 67 million. What I'd discovered was just the visible portion of a massive iceberg of fraud. For 3 days, I remained in protective custody while the investigation expanded. I provided testimony, explained spreadsheets, and identified key players. Each revelation led to new warrants, new arrests, new scandals. On the 4th day, Detective Mendez entered my hotel room with a grim expression. "There's been a development," she said, setting a laptop on the table. "You need to see this." She opened a video file. The timestamp showed it was recorded the previous night. The image showed Ryland, released on bail, sitting in what appeared to be his home office. "I've been falsely accused," he began, his voice steady as he addressed the camera. "A disgruntled employee with limited understanding of complex financial operations has misinterpreted standard practices. My legal team will prove my innocence completely." He continued smoothly, explaining how young employees often misunderstand the sophisticated financial instruments used by investment firms. How regulatory compliance sometimes requires temporary fund movements that might seem unusual to untrained eyes. "He's good," Detective Mendez said, pausing the video. Very convincing. He's lying, I replied. The evidence, the evidence is complicated, technical. He's turning this into a story about a naive young woman making wild accusations against an established financial expert. She studied my reaction. He's posted this everywhere. It's gaining traction. My stomach tightened. Of course he would fight back this way, discrediting me publicly while his legal team worked to dismantle the case. It was smart. It might even work. There's more, she continued, scrolling to another video. This one showed Howard, also released on bail, approaching reporters outside the courthouse. Devra Winters was repeatedly denied promotion due to performance issues. He told the cameras, "This is her retaliation. A vindictive attempt to damage the firm that gave her opportunities despite her limitations." My face burned with anger. That's absurd. I have documentation. Documentation that will take months to sort through in court, Detective Mendez interrupted. Meanwhile, they're controlling the narrative. These are powerful men with powerful friends. So what do I do? That depends, she said, closing the laptop. How far are you willing to go? The question hung between us, heavy with implication. I thought about my mother, who had scrubbed floors for 30 years without complaint, who had taught me that justice mattered more than comfort, who had died 2 years earlier, never seeing me become anything more than an assistant. Whatever it takes, I answered. The next morning, Professor Okoro arrived at the hotel with a large envelope and a determined expression. The officials are getting pressure from above, she said without greeting. 2 senators and a governor have made calls questioning the investigation. The case is solid, but public opinion is shifting as Ryland's PR machine works overtime. She spread documents across the bed, but they made one critical mistake. They assumed you only had access to Paladin's systems. I leaned forward, examining the papers. They were financial records from 4 other investment firms, companies where Ryland and his associates held board positions or advisory roles. How did you get these? Professor Okoro smiled tightly. Let's just say you're not the only one who's been watching them. For years, certain patterns have raised flags. But without internal confirmation, regulators couldn't move forward. Together, we spent hours analyzing the documents. The same techniques, the same shell companies, the same timing patterns, replicated across multiple firms. Conservative estimates put the total fraud at over 200 million. This isn't just about Paladin anymore, Professor Okoro said. This is about exposing a systemic problem across the industry. But how do we get people to listen? Ryland's already painting me as incompetent and vindictive. You fight narrative with narrative, she replied. But first, we need to secure these records properly. There's someone you need to meet. That afternoon, we drove to a nondescript office building in the business district. The sign on the door read simply, Veritas Consulting. Inside, a woman with silver-streaked black hair waited, her posture military straight. Devra, this is Zahira, Professor Okoro introduced us. Former financial crimes prosecutor. Now she works independently. Zahira assessed me silently before speaking. You've stirred up a hornet's nest. I didn't intend to. Intention is irrelevant. Results matter. She gestured for us to sit. Your evidence is compelling but complex. The public doesn't understand financial minutia. They understand stories, villains, and heroes. I'm not trying to be a hero, I protested. Then you've already lost, Zahira replied sharply. Because Ryland is very comfortable playing the villain who's been wrongly accused. His narrative is simple and believable. Ambitious young woman misunderstands complex systems and makes false accusations when denied advancement. The truth of her words stung. In the public arena, technical evidence couldn't compete with a compelling story. So what do? I asked for the second time in 2 days. You tell your story, not just the fraud, but who you are, why you did this. Make people understand what was at stake. Zahira leaned forward. And you reveal the one thing they don't expect you to know. What's that? The names of their clients, the ones they stole from, the real victims. My pulse quickened. I don't have that information. Client data was restricted. Zahira exchanged glances with Professor Okoro. We do. And it's not just wealthy investors. They've been skimming from pension funds. Retirement accounts for teachers, firefighters, public servants. Over 60,000 people affected. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had assumed the victims were wealthy investors who could absorb the losses. Learning that ordinary people, people like my mother, had been the targets transformed my understanding of the case. There's a congressional hearing scheduled for next week, Zahira continued. Originally just a procedural meeting about financial regulations. Now they're expanding it to address this case. Ryland and Howard have been called to testify. And me? If you're willing, yes. But you'll be walking into hostile territory. Several committee members have received campaign contributions from firms connected to Paladin. I thought about running, changing my name, moving to another city, trying to outpace the inevitable retaliation. It would be the safer choice, the rational choice. But the faces of 60,000 invisible victims flashed through my mind. People who, like me, had once been furniture in human form to Ryland and his associates. I'll do it, I said. For the next 5 days, we prepared intensively. Zahira coached me on testimony techniques. Professor Okoro helped organize the financial evidence into clear, understandable segments. Detective Mendez provided updates on the expanding investigation, now spanning 7 states and 3 countries. The night before the hearing, I stood at my hotel window, watching the city lights below. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Walk away now. Last chance. I showed it to Detective Mendez, who added it to the growing file of threats. Some were explicit violence. Others promised character assassination. All confirmed I was on the right path. Sleep evaded me that night. Instead, I rehearsed my testimony once more, focusing on the human impact rather than just the numbers. By dawn, I felt ready. Terrified, but ready. The hearing room was smaller than I'd imagined, but packed with people. Cameras flashed as I entered. Journalists scribbled notes. At the front table, Ryland and Howard sat with their attorneys, studiously avoiding looking in my direction. Committee members filed in, taking their elevated seats like judges at a tribunal. Chairperson Congresswoman Yvette Torres called the session to order with a sharp gavel tap. Today, we address serious allegations of financial fraud at Paladin Financial Services and potentially other institutions, she began. We will hear testimony from key figures involved. Ryland testified first, his voice confident as he dismissed the allegations as misunderstandings by junior staff unfamiliar with standard industry practices. Howard followed, reinforcing the narrative of my incompetence and vindictiveness. Several committee members asked softball questions, clearly sympathetic to the accused. Others pressed harder but became tangled in technical details that Ryland easily deflected. Then it was my turn. As I took my seat at the witness table, Ryland smirked slightly, the same dismissive expression I'd seen countless times when he barely acknowledged my existence. It steadied my nerves somehow, reminding me exactly why I was there. Ms. Winters, Congresswoman Torres began, please explain your role at Paladin Financial Services and how you came to make these allegations. I took a deep breath and leaned toward the microphone. 5 years ago, I joined Paladin as an administrative assistant. I began. I brought coffee, organized files, and became invisible to the executives. That invisibility became my greatest asset. I explained my journey clearly, my self-education, my promotion, my discovery of the discrepancies. I detailed the systematic fraud without technical jargon, making the complex scheme understandable to everyone listening. But this isn't just about numbers, I continued, pulling out a folder Zahira had prepared. This is about people. Real people whose futures were stolen. I read names and details. A retired schoolteacher whose pension fund had been skimmed, leaving her struggling to pay for medication. A firefighter whose disability benefits had been reduced because of market fluctuations that were actually theft. A small business owner whose retirement savings had diminished while Ryland purchased his 3rd vacation home. The room fell silent as the human cost became clear. Even sympathetic committee members shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Winters, one congressman interrupted, these are compelling stories, but can you prove these specific individuals were affected by the alleged activities at Paladin? Yes, I can. I replied, sliding a USB drive across the table. This contains the complete transaction history, showing exactly which accounts were impacted and when. It also contains evidence that this same scheme has been replicated at 4 other investment firms where Mr. Hurst and Mr. Treadwell serve as advisors. Ryland's attorney leaned over, whispering urgently in his ear. Howard's face had lost all color. Furthermore, I continued, the communications records on that drive show deliberate coordination with regulatory officials who were bribed to overlook compliance issues. 3 of those officials have already confessed and are cooperating with investigators. Chaos erupted in the hearing room. Journalists rushed for the doors to file updates. Ryland's attorney demanded a recess. Committee members huddled with their staff. Through it all, I remained seated, my gaze fixed on Ryland. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked directly at me, not through me or past me. In his eyes, I saw something new: fear. The hearing reconvened after 30 minutes. Congresswoman Torres's expression had hardened considerably. Mr. Hurst, Mr. Treadwell, do you wish to respond to Ms. Winter's testimony? Ryland's attorney spoke instead. My client exercises his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination at this time. Howard followed suit. The proceedings concluded shortly after, but the real impact was just beginning. By evening, additional search warrants had been issued for the other investment firms. Regulatory officials named in the communications were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. As I left the building, reporters swarmed around me, shouting questions. Detective Mendez helped navigate me through the crowd to a waiting car. You did well in there, she said as we pulled away. But this isn't over. They still have resources, connections. I know, I replied, watching the Capitol building recede in the rear window. But so do I now. In the weeks that followed, the case expanded beyond anything I could have imagined. 17 arrests across 6 firms. Over $300 million in fraudulent transactions identified. Class action lawsuits filed on behalf of thousands of victims. Paladin collapsed under the weight of the scandal. The board members who had blindly trusted Ryland faced their own legal consequences for negligent oversight. 3 months after the hearing, I received a job offer from the Securities and Exchange Commission, a position created specifically to help identify similar schemes in other firms. I accepted immediately. The day I started my new role, a package arrived at my desk. Inside was a small, worn calculator, the same basic model I'd used when I first began teaching myself accounting at Paladin. With it was a note from Zahira. Never forget how this began. I placed it prominently on my new desk, a reminder of the power of being underestimated. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom as the judge delivered sentences in United States v. Hurst et al. Ryland received 18 years for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Howard received 12. The others received between 5 and 15 years, depending on their level of involvement. As Ryland was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one final time. I met his gaze steadily, no longer the invisible assistant but the architect of his downfall. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked how I felt about the verdicts. Justice isn't about revenge, I told them. It's about restoration. The money recovered will go back to the people it was stolen from. That's what matters most. But privately, as I walked away from the cameras, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The manager who had threatened to make my life hell was beginning nearly 2 decades in prison. The executives who had dismissed me as furniture had lost everything. And the invisible assistant had become the most visible person in the industry. If you're watching this and feeling powerless in your own situation, remember my story. Sometimes being underestimated is your greatest advantage. Sometimes the person they ignore becomes the person they can't forget. And sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, even when you're standing alone, others will eventually stand with you. Like, subscribe, and share if this resonated with you. There are more stories of justice coming, and I wouldn't want you to miss them. Remember, even the most powerful systems can be changed by one person who refuses to look away.